What if these monuments were built because time was running out? You stand very still. The air holds dust-like argument. I will be a quiet guide. I will not rush you. Where are you now? And what time is it where you stand? Stay with the question. There will be no sudden revelations. There will be a slow unfolding, a patient reading of records and clay and silence. If you wish to continue this ritual, subscribe and return when the light is the same. We will move forward together, slowly. This was the assumption that ziggurats first arose from impulse or necessity or faith, the stepped vastness ascending, stone upon stone, as an open hand toward the sky, a shaping of earth into vertical offering, sustained by the hope or fear that the gods required such gesture. To enter the footprint, to trace the shadow, was to inhabit the certainty that at the beginning these were temples. This was the order of things, structure as veneration, foundation as worship, architecture as extension of spirit or desire beyond the visible. Here, the surfaces persist, the summit collapsed by wind, the facing blocks eroded by seasons of rain and silence, the corners lost beneath blown silt, yet still the shape rises from the dust. The accepted story floats above its carcass. First, these were offerings nothing more suspected, nothing else required. Below, the soil remembers differently, uncovered in slow stages, almost resistant to interference, are the remains. Teams advance by layers and increments. Ash and time are sifted. The traces refuse narrative clarity. There are the deposits, embedded beneath the weight of tampered rubble, sealed once by workmen instructed not to leave a mark. Not only votive objects lie hidden in the dark. Among foundation cavities, their surface clay packets, surfaces pressed with impressions too systematic, lines incised with repetition, unemotional, deliberate. The hands at first hesitate. The field notebook opens. Observation. Packets layered beneath platform cores, nestled among mortar and stone, sealed by thin, careful applications of bitumen, each parcel's closure deliberate. These are not prayers moulded in devotion. Instead, the surfaces bear lists, made legible after brushing away centuries of loam and bone. Numbered entries. The script more brisk, more administrative than ceremonial phrases denoting inventories, fragments of instruction, directions passed into sequence and necessity. Here, an inventory marked for contingencies. There, a string of brief ordinances, the ordering of labour, the seasons to watch for breach. Calendars of a sort, pressed in low relief. Not of festivals, but moments of danger, the assessment of threat, instructions for repairing what is certain to fail. Bitumen clings beneath the fingers, staining the gloves, sealing what no air should disturb. The recipes are measured, not mystical. Ratios inscribed for temper, recommendations for firing, a composition to endure long seasons immersed in water, a calculation of strength against the slow assault of floods which leave no witness. The advisories are not declarations of faith. They are guidance, meant as memory that resists decay for as long as the materials may last. Each clay envelope, turned in the palm, resists easy interpretation. Every edge, every press of reed or nail, suspends understanding just beyond reach. Silence accumulates within these chambers, as though every sealed instruction awaits a future reader who never quite arrives. Stratigraphic sections open like pages, though what is written within the section is not narrative but containment. Ash layering above, mortared ridges closing chambers, each intervention an archive of caution. Marked by hands concerned not with gods but with the inevitable quiet of collapse, the ceaseless return of water and rot. The platform above presents its facade of devotion, yet its heart is schematized preservation. Surfaces recorded, entries catalogued, numbers transcribed without embellishment. The field records do not wander. Catalogue entries keep to themselves, column by column, depth measured, orientation ticked, brief notations about bitumen viscosity or clay texture, an accumulation of facts which refuse to convert to story. In the end, the lists remain unyielding, brittle in the hand, sealed against air and thought alike. Each packet is a refusal, a gesture toward the future made cautious, reticent, unable to name the agents or the losses expected to come. The platform above pretends nothing more than stability, masking the quiet desperation set beneath by those who built and reburied and departed. Around the evidence, darkness gathers. Between the packets and the stones, between the records and the observer's hand, the air is thick with what is not spoken, silence as mortar, holding the structure's secrets in a bind that neither time nor excavation can dissolve. The architecture appears devotional, yes. The form persists, the common story persists, but the deposits are otherwise. Lists of cracks to mend, intervals to watch, matters of preservation, not prayer. The gaps endure. Nothing within these brittle archives confesses purpose outright. The deposits cannot speak across the boundary of years. The future stands over these remnants, listening for memory in the absence, hearing only the faint echo of intentions sealed away, always not quite enough to bridge the distance between assumption and what lies beneath. What do these lists ask the future to remember? The narrative of stone is always taken as given. To build, and then inscribe, is to place a name on the earth, a gesture of assurance, an imprimatur of self in petrified form. The ruler's intention, the sovereign's will, rendered permanent through monumentality. This is the accepted assumption, quietly passed on in every guided tour, every polished plaque, each retelling, that the stones are voices for the powerful, speaking their names across eras of silence. It is an assuring order, and the presence of a name in stone offers comfort. There was a hand. It belonged to someone. It carried intention. Yet, as sand settles, as the seasons strip colour from brick, and sun draws the shadow longer across lintel and base, the evidence does not lie down so obediently. The stones, beneath even the most careful attention, resist the expected narrative. There are places where the wall opens, where the surface, so often neatly dressed and squared, drifts into fields of brick, marked not with proclamations, but with codes, both stubbornly impersonal and insistent in their regularity. A date here, pressed with a uniform stamp, a batch number, 6 digits aligned with a manufacturer's rhythm rather than a ruler's pride. Small workshop symbols, triangles, crescents, abstracted motifs clustered at the edge of the block. Nothing of the ruler's titulary. Nothing of the honorific scripts that would make a monument. One could pass a slow hand over the lines, looking for an intonation of presence, but the markings remain mute to the question of authorship. They are not flamboyant. They do not assume an audience. They simply are. Systematic, utilitarian, deeply embedded in the fabric of the structure. They are records, but not narratives, unless one counts the rhythm of work and the clock of restoration as narrative. Further up, where beams once held up thresholds and doors, the field notebooks tally peculiarities, the scorched grain of old timbers, the half-obliterated incisions of layers long buried. Upon closer study, faint scrawls emerge along the darkened edges of wood, rendered in numbers more mechanical than monumental, tied subtly to repairs and phases of reinforcement, rather than a moment of glory set in public view. The marks are quiet, their intent nearly drowned in the accumulation of layers, but always there, persistent, resisting the mythologizing urge. Seams in the stone course and traces of different mortars speak of interruption. The lines of masonry do not declare a single, thunderous moment of creation, but instead hint at a different choreography, planned pauses, intentional dismantling, orchestrated replacement. Here, the rhythm is not of inauguration, but of steady, measured return. The monuments do not stand only to assert. They also bow, shift, and renew, answering to needs more enduring and less vocal than the flash of a name across a cornerstone. Not a single signature rides these seams. What would have been cut away? What filled in? What realignment abandoned the smoothness of a singular, heroic beginning? What kind of monument is built on interruption, on correction, on the labor of those who do not announce themselves? There are, on the surface of these outliers, Brief phrases, short, clipped imperatives, no valedictions, no ornate dedications curling through the surface, but rather the barest concreteness of instruction. The hand, according to the field's careful illustration, is unfamiliar, stripped of flourish, close to a scrawl. The phrase is abrupt, and its reason remains outside the record. Not made for posterity, perhaps not intended for repeated reading, the excavators, unintrusive, transcribe these phrases as they appear. Laconic notations adopted into the ledger of evidence, but left without comment, as if silence were the most honest response. What sort of message manages to endure when stripped of authorship and explanation? In the archives, catalogues maintain steady composure. Entries list the codes, the numbers, the peculiar phrases, no poetic digressions, no theorizing about motive or meaning. The marks are observed, measured, logged, allowed to remain as questions instead of achievements. There is a deliberate withholding not only in the act of inscription but also in its recounting. The silence is curatorial as much as it is historical, a silence that knows itself and holds the rhythm of withheld identity. Here, the absence of it all acquires the sturdiness of evidence. Again and again, the evidence returns to scale without signature, permanence without authorial flourish. The structure remains enormous, the effort incalculable, and yet the script points perpetually outward to those never named, those whose hands coordinated the stones, whose calculations and repairs left behind only procedural residue. You can see where a timber was replaced, infer when a wall admitted an adjustment, and when a facade's batch mark placed it in one phase and not another. But you cannot reach a name. You cannot complete the tableau. It is a study in constraint, how much is withheld, how much effort bends toward endurance, not proclamation. The silence around the makers is as constructed as the monument itself. Partial and persistent, folding itself into each code, each patch of mortar, every numbered beam and utilitarian stamp, not absence, but a refusal to answer the question of who. So, after the dust settles, in the calm repetition of field sketches and ledgers, after the batch numbers have been recorded and the phases catalogued and the seams mapped, one is left lingering within the structure's ambiguous invitation, surrounded by the quiet weight of what endures but does not declare itself. There is an order presumed. There always has been. For generations, the studied silence of the monument's stone and shadow was read as a kind of calendar, set against the unyielding script of the sky. To align with the firmament is to tribute the cosmos, to count days and predict returns. The monuments are said to orient themselves accordingly, a patient obedience, an enduring logic stars, solstices, and the broader rhythm of celestial procession pressed into stone, corridors, and shafts. The narrative is as settled as dust, the kind that gathers quietly in corners, needing only gentle rehearsal to feel inevitable, horizon and zenith written into the measured angle of each emerging wall, suntrack and shadow length filed away as evidence of intentionality. You inherit these interpretations, find them nested in the marginalia, folded into the voice of textbooks and surveyors' annotations. For a time, you accept this astronomy as the governing refrain. But with slow insistence, the accumulated data begins to fray this certainty. In backlit chambers, beneath the regular script, a disturbance takes form. Lines of observation, as steady as they are methodical, disturb the prospect. The weight of new measurements tugs at the prevailing narrative, revealing tension where once there seemed only coherence. Across a sequence of surveys, the expected alignments, those of equinoctial sunrise, circumpolar stars, refuse to correspond to the realized axes of shafts or the descending routes of corridors. Instead, a new pattern draws the eye. Lo, recurring traces that do not fit celestial matrices, but repeat nonetheless along the inner faces of dressed limestone, granular in the dark, silent above the floor. The surveyor's mark is clinical, baseline, angle of cut, elevation, above established datum. The meticulous records hold steady, unconcerned with interpretation. The numbers begin to settle at points neither astronomical nor accidental, The inflection coincides with the subtle ochre banding that follows the course of the old river, mapped in the silted outwash, preserved as a paleocurrent beneath layers of more recent accretion. The stones receive this information without protest, but in their surfaces, at precise elevations repeatedly encountered, are the mineral signatures left by water's slow visitation, an archive less conspicuous but no less persistent than any chiseled inscription. Photographs pulled from decades-old folders preserve these visible records in cool, monochrome. Light plays across the lines of accretion, sharp as a held breath. The camera lingers, its focus drawn not to architectural grandeur, but to the modest residues. Faint halos of discoloration, salt blooms, delicate traces where once water touched and then receded. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would announce itself to the casual observer. Only the patient documentarian, intent on correspondence between mark and measure, notices how the sequence of stains advances and halts, repeating across separate monuments at what, in some other context, would be called a high water mark. The notebooks mirror the evidence without explaining it. Angles and calibrated levels are recorded not as assertions of meaning, but as annotated events, the what, not the why. The observer stands just out of frame, registering increments, adjusting the spirit level, making lines on a page. Time presses itself into these notations less as a chronology than as a now-repeating uncertainty. Each mark, each carefully transcribed value, hints at an episode resumed and contained, the memory of inundation, stamped and receding. These records do not reach conclusions. They accumulate, almost indifferently, at the margins of broader claims. Where one might expect a summing up, a gesture toward resolution or synthesis, there is instead a folding back. In the margins, commentary trails off, replaced by the stubborn residue of mineral in cross-sectioned brick cores. The language of synthesis gives way to the language of stratigraphy. What is measured, what is found, what remains? Each core sample, handled with slow certainty, shows rings of accretion calcified at heights to which the shafts align. The narrative, if it exists, is one told without conclusions, held in the mute record of brined stone and sediment-laden masonry. Even the air feels weighed with the memory of these recurrences, the unglamorous returns of water, folding and refolding into a chronology that admits no declaration. It is possible to cycle endlessly between the presiding assumption and the new record, the monuments as calendars, the shafts as memory, alignments that mark the path of sun and star, or else that register water instead, a registering less of transcendence than of threshold, less of calculation than survival. You are left orbiting this center, surrounded by notebooks and photographs that do not resolve, corridors that persist long after their orientation ceases to seem obvious. There is no final account, no certain translation, only the accumulating traces, the stains that mark both presence and absence, the patterns that rise and subside as quietly as the floods they recall. What kind of future was being counted in those watermarks? Terraces rise in deliberate steps, their planes slowing ascent and descent, accepting the sun and the drifting dust. Along the visible edges, every line seems drawn to bear weight. To focus movement, the accepted assumption moves easily from form to function. Broad stairs and gracious landings are imagined, filled with the rhythm of passing feet. The careful order of ritual crowds channeled across these platforms, worn into avenues by generations of return, so the narrative would have it. Circulation, presence, compaction, an architecture of passage, expected and rehearsed. You enter this story in the aftermath, not at the hour of any gathering. Years have worn the surface, yet the expectation lingers there. Under the powdery hush of settled debris, the landings and steps will be abraded smooth by countless souls. Here, on the stone, will be the tablet of the used and reused, the certainty of presence made durable, unambiguous in the granular record. It is as if not just passage, but memory itself is supposed to compact the surface, each event pressed faintly into the earth with every footfall. The excavation proceeds accordingly. Tools are measured and familiar. Brushes seek out stains, trowels coax colour from stone. The work is rhythmic, almost meditative. A repetition of breath, of survey, of gentle uncovering. The initial promise of the site is not doubted, only circled, as though the familiar story will simply be confirmed and bounded by careful progress. Yet the surface endures, unmarked, unevenly resistant to the script of movement. Steps that should bear the shine or polish of long-used thresholds retain instead the original textures, abrasive in their innocence, betraying no hint of the assumed processions. No single tread is packed, no terrace rendered hard and glassy by the anticipated ritual. Rather than the dense, indelible compression anticipated in circulation spaces, there is a persistent looseness, a dust no more pressed than in untouched ground. In place of compacted detritus, absence, a gentle void. It is not neglect nor incomplete history, but a careful refusal, surfaced in the very layers themselves. Still, you are left not with blankness, but the flicker of a different pattern, revealed in the meticulous cross-section of time. Microstratigraphy draws your gaze away from the broad surface to the fine and peculiar interruptions within the substrate. A systematic recurrence at intervals that seem more measured than accidental. At these points, small sealed niches emerge, sometimes invisible but for the change in plaster or the faint shift in colour, sometimes signalled by the subtle swell where coverage is thicker than the norm can explain. Within these sealed hollows, the evidence accumulates in silence. Earthenware jars composed for containment, folded impressions delicately imprinted with the ghost of textile, slips of clay pressed thin and ordinary, not grand, not decorative, but intentionally small, intentionally enclosed. You kneel at the edge, catalogue in hand, and what is visible becomes divisible. Line by line, a record of dimensions, the diameter of a mouth, the height of an impression, the character of a slip recalled in a neutral, scriptorial tone. Each, in context, is simply entered. Location, depth, object. The act of measurement is itself a kind of reinscription of purpose. Yet the lists are matter of fact, letting each item stand as its own. There is little to annotate but their presence and the silence that gathers over, under, around them. The documentation unfolds unemotionally, methodically. Dimensions, contents, schema, at regular intervals, a jar, a fold mark, a tessera of clay. Always, the written sheets conclude in blanks, spaces not filled, commentary suspended. Sometimes, as you pause, the absence is more resonant than the objects themselves, the lists neither confirming nor denying the stories that were formerly assumed. Each inventory line finishes just short of explanation, a record of having found, not of having understood. Nothing alters the surfaces to suggest the crowded ritual. Nothing compacts the earth to declare transit or presence by numbers. Instead, architecture proposes visibility. Yet the features entomb concealment hollows drawn precisely, their contents neither lost nor displayed, only sequestered, built for gathering, but provisioned for silence. You feel the tension in the architecture, the open terrace, the sealed niche, the unwarded dust, presence on one register, disappearance on another, a choreography of absence running as an undercurrent through material facts. The daylight, when it moves across the terraces, finds nothing disturbed. Every interval is a pause, every landing a held breath. What remains is only the record, the conditioners found, the undecided archive. The air in these places moves as if through a gap between presumption and evidence, sliding through blanks, carrying a weightless hush. The work ends, as it began, with the measurement of things and the measure of uncertainty. The context sheets close with no narrative, only with silence widening toward the unwritten. What was the use of terraces that kept their ground unmarked? There is an assumption, so deeply rooted that it often passes unspoken. Decorative programs exist to be seen, to be admired, to meet the gaze and satisfy it. The wall, the ceiling, the gently curving cornice. Ornament is to be public, a surface for vision, expectation fulfilled in the points where eye meets color, where admiration pauses over crafted shapes. Such is the habit of witness, the quiet arrangement of viewer and viewed, of surface and sensation. This is the before, undisturbed by doubt. But the records persist, quiet notations, methodical in their order conservation reports, inscribed in ledgers whose pages bear the faint pressure of earlier writing. Within these accounts, a different sequence emerges, resistant to the comfort of expectation. Analyses begin with what was found not on the surface, but inside. Pigment, not brushing stone or plaster with its vivid argument, but tightly sealed within the core of walls. Fragments of stucco once gilded with coloured mineral, now lying silent, detached, marked, and removed from the places where light once fell on them. Envelopes pressed into shape by the mineral inside, little paper packets each labelled in a clear, unemotional hand. There is a record of colour, but not the kind imagined by those who wait for spectacle. Instead, it is boxed away. Crushed cinnabar, traces of Egyptian blue, ochre teased from larger stones, ground and sifted, left in small bundles, bundled strips of painted plaster, removed piece by deliberate piece, the edges held smooth beneath gauze, the painted surfaces wrapped, never stacked, always separated by cloth and thin wood, an arrangement structured to prevent harm, an effort so meticulous it leaves behind only the faintest calligraphy of touch. Laboratory notes cross-reference this motif of restraint. Examinations of layer upon layer, gesso, binder, pigment, overlying glaze, rendered not as a haze of memory, but as crisp cross-sections beneath glass, the microscope's gaze more detached than any human eye. Analysts note the stratified colour bands, each one tracing a chronology of application and repair. Old work covered gently by the new. The method of detachment becomes its own data. Scoring along stress lines, careful dampening, a slow release of pigment from surface. The packing is precise, each action meant not to restore, but to contain. The language is factual, describing only what is seen, never what was intended. Names and numbers catalogue everything: the date of removal, the chemical ratios in the binder, the mass of intact pigment, the percentage of surface adhesion retained. All objects accounted for, placed beyond immediate reach, and named only within the confines of formality. To approach the sealed rooms within the cores of these worn structures is to enter not a gallery, but an archive. Wooden crates, unadorned, stagger in rows and are marked by number alone. There is no ornament on their surfaces, no hint of their contents but for what is written on tags, on cloth separators, in the ledger margins. A hush radiates from them, slow and insisting, as if the air itself grows heavier the farther in one stands. Time accumulates in these places, not as dust, but as the slowness of intent, as the silence kept between layers, between one carefully wrapped packet and the next. There is an admission, not of loss, but of deliberate removal from vision, from surface, from the very expectation that ornamental colour confronts the world openly. Evidence does the speaking. The impulse is to listen, not to see. There is the oxidation noted on the pigment fragments, faintly deepening their tone in places, a mark of slow time and the patience of closed boxes. Where one expects display, there is only a careful accounting of absence. The packets of pigment are described as stable, the painted strips as unmounted. The crates have not been disturbed. Over time, documentation becomes memory's only surrogate. The paper and ink endure as the last traces of intention transcribed into record. No one writes of views, of admiration, of ceremony before colour. No one records a moment where a crowd paused to appreciate what has now been kept in darkness. The conservation ledger marks only the transfer surface to storage, vision to record, ornament to archive. The distinction grows pronounced as the description advances. Ornament, having left the field of view, becomes evidence a relic not of presence, but of preservation. Each packet, each wooden crate, insists on its own silence, its own independence from narrative, awaiting only the slow action of time and the occasional, careful inspection of the archive keeper. Within the current arrangement, pigment is both proof and secret. The hush in the reports persists, thick as the quiet in the rooms where colour rests unseen, shielded from intention. Decay halted only for as long as the logic of storage can endure. One reads the ledgers, the laboratory notes, the tags, and returns always to the same threshold, not sight, but recollection. Not display, but the kept record of what was once intended for vision, now withheld and preserved. For whom were colours packed away so deliberately? It begins with a supposition, as much a routine as a conviction. Monumental cores, heavy with stone, faulted with passageways, arranged to face something beyond themselves. The presiding belief lingers in field reports and in the silent architecture itself. Beneath, or within, these carefully constructed masses should lie the primary burials of elites, those who once held sway in life and demanded permanence in death. This expectation adheres to the monument's very shape. Each line and volume read as a preparation, a promise of interment. The form is funerary, the intention presumed singular and grander life marked by a death, a monument raised to hold a body. All the texts repeat, almost as incantation, that these chambers must contain the noble dead. Stepping into the chamber, stone-walled, cool, slightly echoing, you look for the body, presumed to anchor everything. Instead, the tomb-like room resists. There is form, but it is empty, contour without what was supposed to fill it. Where one expects skeletal articulation, skull, vertebrae, a sequence of bones gathered in order, there is only gentle dust. The light, filtered by the long thresholds, settles across the floor and walls, illuminating not the remains of a single life, but evidence of another kind. The recorders, careful and methodical, take note, they collect, they preserve, but the absence sits most clearly in each entry. Field catalogues methodically record each sample, a layer of soot, flecks that blacken with lamp-black carbon, a spread of pollen grains diffused through old dust. Archiving something repeated, never singular. The air is heavy with the reverberations of ceremonies unknown. Soot laminations speak of fire, but without the violence or finality of a funerary pyre. The pollen, seasonally distinct, hints at cycles, offerings, or intrusions. Each assemblage is weighed and measured, samples boxed and numbered, contexts noted with a precision that becomes a kind of reverence. Radiocarbon assays return with their neutral numbers. A date here, a drift there. Everything sits inside its fine envelope. The years are not singular any more than the deposits themselves. Instead of a closed moment, the instant of death. The ceiling of a chamber, there is a slow accumulation. Decade folds over decade. Deposits granular, layered and interrupted. Always promising, but refusing to be conclusive. No articulated skeletons surface from the soil. The notes make this clear. Almost defensive. The osteological absence is written large, not as an accident or a failure of technique, but as chief observation. Here, the report says, is nothing. No vertebrae, no skull, no bones laid out in memory, not even scattered fragments. Instead, the record fixes on what is present. Chemical traces, mineral stains, remains of plants that grew, died, and drifted in across seasons. Each layer calls to mind a hand laying something down, withdrawing, then returning later, a congregation of traces, each unmoored from a final purpose. What remains is the relentless accumulation, each trace more indexical of activity than of a final event. Always, there is the sense of absence being not a lack, but a presence of another kind, a counterweight to expectation. The tension emerges and does not resolve. Monumental forms signal tomb, yet contain no one. The chamber is shaped to persuade the observer that death lives here in primary form, in the resting body of an elite, and yet catalogues, data logs, and field notebooks resist this insistence. In their silence on the matter of burial, they become most articulate. Every omission, every blank line is highlighted as significant. The absence is explicit, not accidental. Recorders say, in so many words and specimens, there is no body, no culminating burial. Instead, soot, pollen, detritus. Evidence not of singular ending but of repetition, echoing through years and generations. The deposits themselves take shape as indexes, signs not of a filled tomb, but of action, returned to and repeated. Ceremonies, or commemorations, or simply attendances, unfold in registers of what they leave behind. Each offering, each moment of deposit, accumulates into a textured history with no climactic point. The site becomes not a sealed container of a life ended, but an ever-open record of lives returning, seasons passing, rituals renewing. The archives preserve lists, but the blank where the body should be is a kind of narrative in its own right. The record is punctuated, always, by the phrase, none observed, absent, noted void. In the telling, what is missing gains its own register, its own insistence. You study the stacks of bags, each labelled with numbers and contexts, their silence more poised, more telling than speech or declaration ever could be. There is a quiet loss here. Memory enacted not through the singular, the culminating, but through repetition, through gestures building layer upon layer, contouring time itself. The chamber remains, empty of its supposed dead, yet filled with strata of remembrance, offerings, and actions without final resolution. Archive and witness merge. What, then, is enacted here not burial, but a different sort of memory, small, recurrent, unending in its incompletion. You begin in the steadiness of what was once trusted, the sense that great spaces' monumental precincts persisted, anchored in constant activity, held in the soft gravity of uninterrupted use. This image presented itself for decades, maybe longer, settling quietly into the literature and into the memory of the field. A sureness. These stones never slept, these passages always open, the thresholds perpetually crossed, every echo only a moment away from the next. The assumption became the unspoken air, breathed in by every observer, codified by repetition, by absence of contradiction. The precinct as perpetual vessel, awaiting only the next procession, the next ceremony, the next inevitable return. But there are layers beneath certainty. A deeper silence emerges at the cut edge of a trench, where the stratigraphic profile fractures the narrative. Here are not merely increments of dust and detritus, but interruptions, horizons marked by mortar spill and slabs of roofing set down not in collapse, but in closure, thick, intentional, their sequence too deliberate to walk past unwitnessed. There is the mortar, pooled and set, curving to a finish that does not leak or yield. There are plugs fitted into passageways, stone and clay forced until stillness. The negative imprint of removal absent, untouched, since the day of sealing. You see it in the ledgers, horizons described by their endings, not by what continued above them. Soil chemistry repeats itself in these closed bands. An altered oxidation, measured and recorded, different from the restless breathing earth above. The signal is neither loud nor decorative, just patient, just present. Behind every intentional closure is a moment prolonged, an extended interval marked not by use, but by invitation withheld. Ramps outside the entrances vanish beneath thick backfill, composition graded and worked by hand. The slope measured by a logic that insists on purpose. The grade draws a blunt new line across the memory of access. This far. Dust settles in layered sequence above the closure. Nothing but the weight of time, no intrusion, no trespass. Excavation records find not even the incidental evidence of later hands. No potsherds misplaced, no fragments of passage scraped away, no borrowed stone. Each closed horizon is a pause written into earth and left without annotation. The field team moves quietly, tools slow, the ledger growing with each sealed band. There is a kind of reverence in the repetitive cataloguing, names and depths, materials and tonalities of fill, each signature of closure preserving its own silence. Here, the documentation trails off, shifting from orderly lines to blankness. Descriptive prose recedes where certainty slackens, where there is nothing further to say that would not overreach the boundaries of what endures. The profiles freezing an interval, the moment of closure preserved as absence, all that comes after built only on air and recollection. Sealed horizons are not mere accidents of fate. Their intention lies not in the violence of destruction, but in the suggestion, the almost audible pause before duration resumes. Mortar does not flake or break, but guards, pressed into place not by collapse but by design. Soil chemistry tells the same story in numbers and charts, the signature of exclusion marked where air and water do not travel, where the pulse of the outside world ceases for a time. Yet the chemistry, the strata, the slabs and plugs remain silent regarding why and for how long and at whose discretion. The ledgers can only reiterate the pattern, not resolve it. Every return to the site is shadowed by this accumulation. You sift through seals upon seals, each entered dutifully, each returning the observer to the edge of knowing. No later disturbance, each upper layer undramatic, untouched. The evidence is always slightly beyond completion, never quite answering, allowing only for another circle around the heart of the precinct, another measurement, another silent description. The reports become less words and more the memory of closure made visible. There is absence in what is not found, the missing tokens of daily use. The trace of habitation never resuming, the absence grows, becomes its own artifact. A before marked by presence, an after marked by intention, followed only by the long absence and the subtle chemistry of locked-away air. These moments are sealed, sometimes for an unknown season, sometimes perhaps forever. The monument's life cycle is not a line, but a series of closures, intervals within which nothing stirs except the aging of mortar and the breathless, unremarked transformation of soil. The ledgers and the profiles are left to speak the last word, silent, orderly accounts of what was closed, when, and only by inference, by patience, the shape of what was left behind. You turn away from the records with more questions than findings, the weight of what is unrecorded gaining force as every horizon recedes again into darkness. What decisions led caretakers to close and leave these spaces behind? It begins, as so many rehearsals of the past do, with what is accepted, the weight of inherited knowledge, settling almost imperceptibly, tells us, all that monumental works materialize as a single gesture. A wall rises from foundation to summit in one unbroken surge, a structure cast in the image of uninterrupted intention. Line upon line, stone upon stone, the story has always been of progress without interruption. One campaign, continuous, definitive. This is the assumed rhythm. It is an architecture of certainty, rendered as a seamless line of labour and resolve. And yet, under the guided light of slow discovery, the evidence stands in quiet disobedience. Cut stones reveal seams, joints that assert themselves in the regularity of intervals, not hidden but neither featured. They appear again and again, mapped with the patience of someone listening for another tempo nested beneath the obvious one. Regular interruptions, each a near vertical pause, marking thresholds in the building's ascent. Under brush and dust and the sifted passing of time, these breaks emerge, plain and deliberate. There is nothing hurried about them. In the spaces between, the masonry yields small secrets. Observers bend close. Their lines and notes, crisp in field books, trace each joint, not just in stone, but in what brackets the stone. Caches, discreet but insistent, sit embraced by mortar. Some nearly vanished, others refusing to dissolve even as centuries bear down. Sometimes there is a clay envelope, fragile, tucked against the inner skin of the joint. Sometimes a sliver of a tool, rust traced in palimpsest, spanning the width of 2 stones. Not accidental, never casual. Patterns reveal themselves slowly, only for those who endure repetition without expectation of closure. The caches repeat. They are measured, catalogued, their contents shifted, with careful fingers into trays and envelopes of their own. Drawings, methodical and neat, map these joints layer by layer. The skin of the wall tells a modular story, each interval marked by the residue of intention. The field hands pause, carbon dust settling, and they sketch not just the discontinuity of masonry, but the layers that gather at these thresholds. A protective coating, sometimes chalky, sometimes gelatinous with ancient oils, brushed onto the stone's surface ahead of each pause. The substance pools faintly at the edges of the joint, becoming both shield and signpost. Conservation records note its thickness, its changing hue, a covert memorial beneath each resumption of labor. The presence of the coating is not universal, but it is noted wherever it is found. The hands that applied it vanish. Only the quiet residue remains. Catalogues grow. Tablets, beads, textile impressions. The laboratory's registry is not narrative, but inventory, recording the contents of each cache with a discipline sharpened against speculation. Small clay tablets, impressed with markings so fine they almost refuse to be read. Patterned beads, their colors muted by centuries of breathless stillness, confined to the silence between actions. Sometimes folded textile, its weave pressed into another surface before losing the memory of color or form. Each object arranged against a neutral background, photographed, described with all particulars. Date, dimension, presence of residue. What is folded, what is flat, what is deliberately patterned. Lists, stripped of story, acknowledge the abundance of what is not known. Mortar joins the silence. Conservation notes, gathered and cross-referenced, remark on the peculiar difference of the mix sealing the caches. It is never quite the same as the ordinary binder that clings elsewhere, always marked by variations, sometimes denser, darker, faintly glimmering with unfamiliar grit. Perhaps an invitation. It is listed, described, archived, with the impassivity required by those who witness more absence than presence. Pause after pause, the evidence accumulates not as event, not as revelation, but as a sequence marked by intention and endurance. The building is no longer singular nor continuous. Instead, it reveals itself as an act, undertaken in deliberate stops, with each interval becoming not only a point of rest, but a vessel. Preservation is not aftermath, but woven into the act of building, at every stop, every threshold layer, a choice made and remade, assent to intervals, a pause that is bracketed and bracketed again. The wall's rise is choreographed with absences, not failures of the will or interruptions of the plan, but periods of enforced stillness, pregnant with the act of setting something aside. Notebooks close after these silent catalogues. The descriptions trail into silence, measured and final. What remains is the tension between story and stone, between what is carried forward and what is set aside for other eyes, other hands, in other centuries. Memory halts at these junctures, and the dust settles once more. Who decided when a pause would become a deposit for the future? After the long sweep of wind and sand, after countless years under sun and cloud, a monument stone will bear the marks of its endurance. This is the accepted story, transmitted quietly from observer to observer, inscribed in field notes and whispered in lecture halls. Surface hardness is explained as the body's slow defense, a crust slowly compacted by human footsteps or an accidental encounter with flame. Stone, it is said, hardens under centuries of attention or misfortune, and all things that survive above silence must inevitably harden or break. These are the explanations permitted by habit, preserving the line where history rests undisturbed and interpretation remains ornamental only. Yet in the archive's hush, a different narrative is crystallized, if not spoken. Microscope slides bear a thin gloss of evidentiary discomfort. Samples taken from stair treads and thresholds, harvested gently from their context with a practiced hand. In the lamplight, each section reveals a layer, smooth and vitreous, too perfect to be the commerce of chance. There is a curve of light across their surface, a line of separation that hush between outer vitrification and the coarser body below. Material analysis turns this ambiguity into notation. In tables and laboratory logs, the language is careful, distinguished from accidental heat by their regularity and persistence. The surface is not simply worn nor burned, as would be expected by habit or accident. Instead, here is vitrification measurable, replicable, deliberate in its limits. The laboratory's technical logbooks preserve the rigor of this realization. Temperature calculations, comparative charts, precise measurements of depth, sheen, and phase. Temperature estimates derived from minute changes in crystalline structure or the telltale roundness of silicate nestle beside black and white microscopy images, the stark division between fired and unfired stone leaping forth in monochrome. The hand that writes is careful, slow, aware that overstatement would fracture the fragile wall between record and fantasy. Each number entered is an act of restraint, a promise not to press meaning too far, not to conjure intent where only process is visible. Reinforce the sense of anomaly. Duplicate firing regimes are run slow, fast, accidental, intentional, in carefully constructed analogues, none matching the complexity and thinness of the original surface layers. The logs always fall short of certainty. Statements accumulate, but meaning quietly refracts. The vitrification resembles no unplanned blaze, no careless accumulation of hearth ash, no wildfire leaping into the night. The notes do not make claims. They simply compare, mark, and describe firing windows, temperature plateaus, the residual trace of molten sheen. In the field, the same pattern emerges. Fused strata, thin as a thought, gleaming on steps and thresholds where passage has left its mark. The surfaces lie, not broken but transformed, the product of a controlled principle, elusive and undramatic, a silent archive of intention. Photographs are taken in careful sequence. Every feature is measured, plotted, cross-referenced with diagrams scribed in dutiful notebooks. No voice intrudes here, only the meticulous retracing of contact, heat, duration, a geometry of transformation hidden in plain sight. In the technical notes, there grows the outline of a system, thermal processes employed not for spectacle or swift destruction, but for the slow extension of material time. The evidence sits between categories, unsettling yet never confessional. Is it engineering or accident, design or long happenstance, endurance or quiet desperation? The record keeps to restraint. It allows for ambiguity. Lets absence prowl the periphery of each logged observation. What cannot be known is allowed to remain suspended, half shrouded by the vocabulary of process and comparison. The act of cataloguing persists a steady counterpoint to the ambiguity of interpretation. Each sample, cut and numbered, is stored in boxes lined with archival grey. The boxes are themselves unremarkable, labelled only in ink, barely distinguishable from 100 other samples taken on different days from quieter sites. Yet within, the slices of stone record the gulf between routine and intention. In the cool dark of the archive, they are at rest, embodying neither certainty nor oblivion. The stair treads, the thresholds, these intermediary surfaces, each carries the remnant of attention, but for whose hand or foot they endured, the record does not venture to say. No names attend the technical notes. No inscriptions break the meditative hush of the storeroom shelves. There is nothing here but the thin fused barrier, a membrane between epochs, between what wore away and what was preserved by fire. Was it for endurance, for ritual, for trespass, or for some purpose now vanished into the interval between vitrification and dust? For whose use were surfaces intentionally fused to endure? It is a view that arrives easily, almost reflexively. The summit, exposed to wind and sky, is imagined as a surface, an elevated ceremonial platform, elevated and unveiled, set apart by altitude and intention. Ceremony, once assumed, becomes its own kind of veil, drawn over stone and silence. What is seen from below, broad capstones, set with deliberate geometry, smooth under the sweep of light, invites a certain reading. The higher stones are for gathering, for declaration, for ritual that requires the eye of the open sky. This is what you are offered at first glance. The assumption recited and passed on, unworried through the long years. Nothing above, nothing within, only the stage prepared in perpetuity. This consensus is written in the margins of older reports, carried in the understated notes of early visitors who stood at the summit and looked outward, satisfied to conclude that what mattered was upon the surface. But with excavation, carried not by curiosity but by the slow, methodical momentum of restoration, this uniformity falters. What was solid yields, not quickly, but by degrees. Removal of the capstones, each action catalogued, each increment of displacement matched to its location in the ledger, reveals an underside, not anticipated, not entirely denied, simply unconsidered until the first cavity is unsealed. Evidence accumulates. The ledger documents the cadence of discovery. Here is a cavity cut with precision, its dimensions exact, not left to happenstance, a record of depth, of width, of alignment, measured in units that seem both contemporary and ancient. Each cavity concealed beneath a capstone, the join so fine it becomes invisible beneath the dust of time. Inside, contents neither monumental nor decorative, but elusive in scale. A clutch of small inscribed tokens, edges worn yet carefully handled, their inscriptions neither translated nor theorized in the margins. Offerings, perhaps, or remembrances, but always described only as objects. Metal flakes are layered among them, reflective in the torchlight, their origins unstated, entered only as minute metallic fragments, composition untested. The compacted impressions of organic matter, the outlines blurred yet suggestive of intention. Nothing is overtly precious, nothing explained. Each cavity is sealed, not ostentatiously, but by a thin stone coverstone, selected, shaped, and gently pressed into place. There is attention paid to the matrices of sealing, a term recurring through the registrar's language. Layering, the choice of clay or fine silt to buffer the coverstone, the pressure needed to create a flush boundary. All this described not in conjectural language, but in sequences. Coverstone lifted, cavity exposed, measurements taken, specimens transferred. It is marked by thoroughness rather than oversight. Numbered photographs accompany the ledger entries. The slow incline of the summit in grayscale, each capstone braced in position before removal. Gloved hands, tools paused mid-task not to dramatize, but to document the pause itself, the moment when stone yields to reveal another silence beneath. There is a patience to these images, an acceptance of the unhurried progression from surface to interior, from expectation to anomaly. They observe. Once the contents are recorded, there is a reversal, equally meticulous. Capstones are returned to their placements. The fill is re-leveled, not quite indistinguishable, but close enough to restore the appearance of undisturbed intention. The act of replacement is captured as evidence itself, a visual footnote, a deferral. No gloss is added by the observer. The restoration is another layer in the accrual of memory. The registrar does not speculate, does not move past the level of detail. The catalogue number, the dimension cross-referenced against grid and elevation, the summation, if it emerges, remains implicit. Storage rather than spectacle, retention rather than only display. And yet, even this reframing halts before certainty. The index swells, capstones, reimagined as entries on a shelf, their numbers aligned as if awaiting another kind of reader. The notion of a slow library arises only by proximity, the repetition of cataloguing seeping through the record. What is placed is not discarded, nor revealed, but arranged awaiting suspended within stone. Each cavity, each token, each minute flake or faded impression fulfills a role not named in the registry, preserved for interpretation by some unseen hand. Never directly addressed, always suspended between composition and meaning. You hold the record as one might hold a fragment, trying not to disturb dust that carries more memory than certainty. There are no declarations, only an accumulation of described absence, an inventory that traces the outline of intention yet never steps into the circle of knowing. Silence thickens over the peaks for every token unearthed. Another is hidden, resealed, catalogued, rendered mute by preservation. The summit remains above, untouched once more, in outward aspect. Yet the ledger rests heavier, layers pressing patiently inward, awaiting the next witness. Who placed messages in these heights for hands that have not yet come? It is easy to rest within inherited certainties. Elite projects, palaces, channels, massive walls must, so the unseen consensus assumes, spring from command, decrees cascading down corridors, enforced by the hard edge of overseers and the anonymous toil of pressed labor. The vision persists, static and unyielding. A ruler's word, transmitted through layers of authority, transforms into columns raised, roads unfurled. The dust of generations settling over the names of those who bent beneath the task. The palace as architect, the laborer as cipher, this is the image sheltered behind every monumental facade. It is the background hum of the historical record, the barely questioned ground on which so much interpretation stands. But the silence of stone yields, sometimes, to the fragile interleaving of archives. The assumption meets its interruption not in proclamation, but in the close and faintly luminous evidence of an alternative ledger. Here, deep in the measured quiet of storerooms and strata, administrative tablets emerge clay, marked and indexed, each one a small island of intention. Not the voice of the palace, but the rhythm of logistics, unremarkable and persistent. You pass your eyes, decade after decade, over surfaces pressed with cuneiform, impressed with account. They catalogue not moments of violence or architectural triumph, but allotments. Rations meted and measured, rotating crew rosters assembled piece by piece. The residue of a system that neither celebrates nor condemns, merely counts. Their content is exacting, almost repetitive in its discipline. Names or household marks carved with care, columns of daily portions rising and falling with the span of weeks, months, years. Each scheduled task listed a sequence of maintenance duties, the caretaking of structures not in bursts, but as a continual undertaking. The hand of the record keeper is present, guiding each line into the cadence of an ongoing cycle. Allot, consume, rotate, repeat. For generations, the system persists. Some tablets survive, dogged and inert, imprinted with the detritus of lived obligation. Some fracture, their edges worn, meaning trailing into silence. Each tablet is catalogued, find spots logged in field notebooks, weight classes measured in clipped technical notation. The stroke of the stylus speaks, not in eloquence, but in sequence. Portions, names, duties. Layered beneath the palace's shadow, the archives declare another kind of order, not episodic, not corvée summoned for great spectacles, but maintenance, ongoing, almost mundane in its persistence. Crew lists roll forward across generations, substitutions made with the same careful regularity as the distribution of barley or oil. The translation reduces all this to numeric chains. The discipline of logistics abstracted into lines, easily overlooked by grandiose chroniclers. Time circulates. The compilers, gone now, leave in their wake the residue of administrative attention. Crew rotations inscribed but never explained, portions granted without commentary. The written record trails off, unnoticed, into the blankness of loss. Pages ghost away. In the lacunae at the edge of a tablet, a planned rotation lingers, inscribed, awaited, unfulfilled. You reach for continuities but find only silence. Every record tends toward its own erasure. Absences multiply. It would be futile to seek completion. The mechanism persists only in fragments. Lists that conclude with no reckoning. Tasks whose closure evaporates amid missing lines. The palimpsest of the archives is built of residue-traced intentions, lost outcomes. Still, the administrative hand inscribed a world in which labour was not episodic punishment or brief festival duty, but the engine of unfinished maintenance. Shared rations, distributed each day, each week, cycle into shared exhaustion, shared absence, shared forgetting. And sense the accumulation of generations. The tablets record no voices, only allocations finite, impersonal units sustaining both structure and silence. The sequence lingers, indexed, classified, unread, until the dust granted modern hands brief license to observe. It would be easier if corruption or compulsion could be inscribed so clearly, but the record is only what it is: silent, attentive, elusive, fragments surfacing from dust. The weight of each tablet, a register of marks almost, but not quite, forming a whole. The administrative archive invites little certainty, only the recurrence of method, the routine of ration and roster. The shadow of intention falls unevenly across the record, leaving gaps, maintenance but not resolution, absence but not closure. You stand at the edge of the archival field, crossing and recrossing the interval between what was recorded and what was lived. The question arises, not with fanfare but as a whisper edged with the gravity of passing time and irrevocable silence. Who, in the end, carried forward the labour regimes inscribed in these ration lists? Year after year, when memory itself became only the hush between one entry and the next, it is said, almost axiomatically, that the builders of monumental texts form their sentences for the ears and eyes of their own time. The accepted belief sits quietly, asserting its comfortable logic, that the hands setting wedges to clay, or the stylus racing over the soft tablet, leave messages to be interpreted by those who share their breathing air, their spoken words, their daily rhythms. Writings are presumed to be tethered to their moment, linked by the fragile cords of shared understanding, context, familiarity. To read is to witness a mirroring, a unity in time. Tablets emerge not in open halls of reading but withdrawn into deep recesses, behind partitions carefully blocked and later forgotten. Their surfaces are neither expressive nor ornamented. Instead, labels press up in more than one script, distinct, regimented, difficult to align, like two languages resisting fusion. Each inscription is dense, compressed, refusing flourish, offering only the most necessary shapes. The compactness is not only physical, but also syntactic. Sentence fragments collapse into commands, sequences, formulae. To the observer, this text is not a song, nor a prayer, nor the tracing of history. It is something less, and perhaps, paradoxically, something more. You run gloved fingertips along the cuneiform. Where poetic lines would unfurl, there is only repetition. Where narrative might spiral, instead, inventory. A list, but not merely a list, a catalogue, dense with references. The same phrase recurs with little variation, separated only by geometric scansion or the sharp division of numbers. Cross-referenced inventory numbers populate the margins, always systematized, never improvisational. Here, then, is a language honed for exact replication, repetitive as rainfall, persistent as the untiring tide. No pronouncements, only the machinery of preservation, the syntax of the archive, the drumbeat of system imposed on matter. A silence hangs in the storeroom, enveloping the shelf where these tablets rest. You visualize the sequences. A label in one script, its counterpart rendered beneath or beside in the second. Sometimes there is a slight abrasion, where the wedge never fully took, sometimes a gap, thick with the possibility of a lost character or an unfulfilled word. Dates appear, but not as remembered celebrations, no feast, no coronation. Only a vertical stack of marks indicating the passage of some unremarkable, clockwork sequence. A year, a king, a cycle reset. The phrasing is a command: store, record, enumerate, retrieve. Each imperative is clipped, efficient, terse. There is no motive, no guiding hand, only the unspooling mechanism of instruction and time. Unyielding. One cannot easily say for whom these words were intended. The multiple tongues, the calculated redundancy, the very absence of embellishment, they suggest not a singular audience, but a hypothetical one. Perhaps a reader, perhaps only a watcher, a later observer tasked with decoding not beauty, but function. As language shifts, as generations recede, the words morph into shapes, then shadows, then the faintest traces. The text refuses to anchor itself in a single voice. It echoes, instead, around the hollow of changing tongues, each repetition an act of preservation against oblivion, yet never quite reaching anyone fully. The message suspends itself not in speech, but in form, in the anchorings of inventory and index. Stored within these sealed recesses are not celebrations of identity or expressions of the sovereign will, but rather rubbings and transliterations, derivatives, shadows of shadows. The original clay, marked and then shielded behind blocked thresholds, is encountered only in mediated form. Rubbing, copy, abstraction. The voice has long since retreated. In its place, silence rises, punctuated only by the tremor of a name now reduced to number. A command hollowed out by repetition. The transmission endures because it is emptied of history, sustained only by the pulse of record and reference. Field notes, yellowed and colorless, recount the process of discovery with the same restraint. A doorway is unblocked. The light of day falls on clay untouched for centuries. The find is noted not with exclamation or speculation, but with indexation, cross-referenced, correlated, labeled. The tablets are lifted, documented, transliterated. Each operation insists upon neutrality. Each step extends the distance between inscription and understanding, between what was once intended and the dwindling pool of what can still be grasped. There is comfort, perhaps, in the method, but also an ache, a sense that something vital has quietly slipped from grasp. Hands hovering at the threshold between what endures and what dissipates. The evidence remains, layered and silent, bound by clay and by the discipline of its own inexorable logic. The meaning is caught somewhere between languages, between numbers, between the mechanistic pulse of repetition and the dissolving echo of lived voice. The archive keeps what it can. Rubbings, sequences, inventory, format. The rest is left outside, left to fade, to imagine, to lose. Time moves forward. The scripts remain, pressed into the emptiness, like a breath held just too long. Who, if anyone, was ever truly meant to read these messages when language is always shifting away? It is easy, perhaps, to rest in the comfort of defined edges. The accepted assumption repeated in dry treatises and echoed in half-remembered oral recounting is that borders fix a polity in place. Here stands the stone, here is the line. You are inside, or you are beyond. To cross is to enact rupture, or to acknowledge order. To mark is to settle where movement must end. The markers, so it is thought, mean what they say. They are the anchors of certainty, the architecture on which memory and authority quietly depend. There are records to consider: survey documents, field ledgers, the careful columns of geometers, and these persist past their usefulness, waiting for their questions to surface. The stones tell another story, though the language is worn and the phrase is incomplete. A boundary marker, so unremarkable at a distance, reveals on slow inspection that its bed is no longer native. The surrounding soil resists, composition at odds with settling. The precise coordinates of its current pose are tabulated in the register, but the angle of repose diverges from what should have been the marker, leans inward, a degree or two off, a subtle realignment. Not one, but several of these boundary stones and stelae bear the trace. Surface examination proceeds in ritual silence. Grains of dust yield under thumb, offering up the soft erasure of time. The bulk of the stone is carved, but the face present is not the only one. One surface blazons a familiar name, its glyphs scored shallow by age. Turn the stelae a fraction, and another, older inscription becomes visible along the edge, half buried beneath recut margins. The side faces, which should bear nothing, are crowded instead with secondary signs, the outlines clumsy, almost urgent, as if imposed by a later, quieter hand. The field notes resist speculation. The terminology holds: recuts, noted, reuse of face, observed. Yet the erosion patterns are not ambiguous in their direction. The weathering is on one side heavier, as if that side had once lain against the elements, then shielded, then returned anew to the open air. Millennia register in flourishes of lichen, the softened edges tracing the path of exposure. Concealment. Exposure again. Each change is both an erasure and a renewal. What was once the boundary face becomes an interior nothing, then returns to the status of edge. The field register accumulates these observations with mechanical patience. There are coordinates and corrections, angles documented, a faint indentation beside one entry, as if the scribe paused to consider before moving on to another line. Less assertive than stone, have their own archives. Their flat faces show grooves where fresh numerals or ciphers were cut atop the fading bones of earlier marks. Some corners are rebuilt clay pressed in and fired anew, the overlap barely visible. A seam in the narrative. Schematic diagrams close the dossier, each a testament to persistence and revision. One plan overlays another, slight shifts articulated in ink, the geometry tightening inward, along axes that resist interpretation. The diagrams do not instruct, they only offer the bare fact of motion, restrained, repeating, incomplete. No note is entered for the pause at dusk, or the muttering of those who stood in witness. Instead, only the aftermath, preserved in the mute witness of rearranged stone. The stelae do not explain the impulses that drove their movement. The text of inscription is recalcitrant. Each set of names, each formulaic offering, each direction is presented just as it was left. Yet the palimpsest records internal negotiations not at the fringes, but within the very substance of the monument. Here, limits are redrawn inside the stone, not outside. Space folds back on itself. The act of boundary making is revised, overwritten. There are no explanations in the margins. What is preserved, what is lost, is managed by these slow, methodical shifts. The evidence accumulates in silence. Absence and surplus coexist. The erased line pressing against the visible, the old direction yielding, but not quite vanishing. The field register, so precise, closes each entry with a notation referencing only the next adjustment. The plans are silent on intention. The account remains partial, circumspect. No editorial voice intrudes. There, only stones repurposed. Here, markers quietly rotated, turned inward, registered once, and then again, in altered light. The moments of decision are absent. What remains is displacement, marked and measured, but not explained. In this, memory is shaped anew, each revision contained within the silent persistence of stone and clay. The negotiation is not broadcast, but embedded, inscribed obliquely in surfaces made and remade. The body of the monument thickens. The record turns cyclical, each pass layering another unanswered uncertainty. Only the schematic plans endure, orderly in their abstraction, closing over what cannot be named. What social practice rearranged limits, and why were those changes recorded in stone rather than spoken? It begins with a comfortable certainty. A quiet idea settled into the mind. Wall plaster, carrying its old, singular signature, holds a single moment, a gesture frozen beneath lime and pigment. This is the presumption that guides so many hands in the field and in the lab. A surface is read as a final word, the visible inscription as the only intended message, clean, orderly, enclosed within the bounds of its making. A record left undisturbed, unlayered, untouched by subsequent intention. The notion persists, even as other stories suggest themselves at the very edge of perception. Conservation dossiers, methodical and reserved, reveal an undercurrent of complication, a palimpsest, not in the parchment sense, but deep within the mineral grains of plaster. In these folders, there is no drama, only lines of typed observation. The recurring word layer, embedded almost unconsciously as a refrain. Microsamples from undisturbed corners glance sideways at the exposed face. Under loops and cold lights, a stratigraphy emerges. Plaster does not merely record, it accumulates, concealing less by intention than by ritual repetition. What appears whole is, in fact, marked by sequences, a fine incision. No erasure, only renewal. Cross-sections, isolated by scalpel and resin, drift beneath the lens under magnification. Each photograph fixes a field, not of color, but of process. Laboratory sheets list these pigment transitions with distant precision. Layer 2, red. Layer 3, pale brown intrusion. Layer 4, black, organic tape. Sometimes, the earlier marks remain almost untouched, pressed beneath the mass of later applications, gentle but inviolable. Elsewhere, the later inscriptions settle above, neither celebrating nor obscuring their predecessors, simply resting in a quiet truce, one text nested under another, neither fully privileged nor effaced. It chronicles the delicate work, preserved older incisions under new administrative record. No editorializing, only a notation of method and result. Hands move slowly with blade and brush, aware that removal might erase not simply a name or number, but an entire sequence of choices, each preserved as a kind of mute testimony. At times, the additions do not destroy, but acknowledge by superimposition a deliberate imprecision in which past and present lists coexist. Updates are made not by obliteration, but by the act of writing over. Lists of supplies, tallies of tasks, layered as seasons layer dust, careful not to disrupt the silent witness awaiting below. The wall, it seems, is permitted to remember without ever speaking. Field notebooks, busy with observation elsewhere, become cryptic or even mute where the overlaps gather too thickly. There are stretches in which the annotation ceases, a whiteness on the page mirroring the opaque wash of lime on the wall. It is not always possible to follow where text meets text, where one record interrupts and another survives. The evidence accumulates, but knowledge does not clarify. The observer must stand aside, unable to resolve the tangle of choices embedded in this material archive. Gaps multiply. It is the density of the unreadable that is marked, not the presence of sense. So, the plaster endures, stratified and ambiguous. A textscape built by accretion. Every addition, both a preservation and a partial obscuring of what came before. There is a patience in such things, a melancholy in the refusal to choose between old and new. Time stacks its documents not as replacement, but as overlay. Meaning is deferred. The wall waits, a silent custodian, removed from explanation. In the end, the documentation circles back to its threshold. The single inscription is not alone. Newer lists settle above old incisions. Pigment runs traverse ancient wounds. Laboratory documentation freezes each encounter, but never untangles intention. The field log inscribes absence as carefully as it notes survival. Each layer, both visible and lost, quietly insists on its place. The true record is composite, unresolved, intimately bound to silence and time. Why did they choose, again and again, to overwrite rather than erase? It is a quiet assumption, settled like dust on the stones. These decorative motifs, encrusting ancient surfaces, are scenes from myth. Pattern as memory, image as story, a tapestry of the fantastic recited in silent stone. This is comfortable. It lulls. It allows each figure, each flourish, to belong a fragment of something, once sung or told, now frozen in a tableau we can almost recall, if not quite remember. To look at them, one might believe that every curve and flourish is an echo of a hero, a beast, a god, their allegories wrapped in the certainty of repetition. But the records offer a shift in the light, a disturbance at the surface. The iconographic inventories will not settle for myth. They detach the patterns from narrative and index them against objects. Seals, presses, official artifacts. Many of these motifs, when examined slowly, resist elaboration. The lion is not a lion, the bull not a bull. The rosette never quite resolving into flower or sun. Reduced, condensed, almost schematic, they slip away from the world of story and into the ledgers, catalogued as marks as much as images. Not every motif is a scene. Some are only signs. Catalogues line the shelves, thick with entries that follow a different rhythm. Here, the language is the language of impression, stamp, repeat. Workshop seals ordinary, practical, linked not to mythic narrative, but to administrative record. Each motif cross-referenced, not with a tale, but an inventory number. These marks return again and again, persistent, placed in ledgers, in tallies, on tokens to be counted. Arches of recorded impressions, spiral arrays, neat rows of marks unspooling across the clay. The act of repetition is the act of order, not the act of story. Drawing sheets spread flat on tables. Coloured lines tracing the forms without flourish, without imagination. The same emblem, simple, declarative, arcane in repetition and simplicity. Side by side, these images resist sequence. There is no before, no after. The arrayed signs do not flow. They accumulate. Absence of progression. Absence of climax. These are not events retold. They are records made complete through duplication. The sequence of a narrative yields to the regularity of impression, the register of presence, absence, affirmation. Yet the tension is palpable. Patient, imagery caught between the expectation of story and the function of reference, index, or code. The silence within the motif, the refusal to spell out meaning, erodes at the comfort of the narrative assumption. There is ceremony in repetition, but no unfolding drama. Instead, a ledger, a sign pressed into wet surfaces, again and again, until the record stands untouched by time and explanation alike. In cupboards, within drawers, the inventory expands index cards, cross-references, register numbers, the discipline of the archive holding the motifs in stasis. Search the catalogues. Motifs are grouped by formal attributes, not by episode or mythic transformation. Each register entry ends before any elaboration can begin. Where one expects a citation of a source, an attribution of legend, the record stops. A mark, a number, a physical description, the motivation is not stated, the meaning held at bay. You may witness them as though moving in circles, always approaching but never crossing the threshold of interpretation. The surfaces invite. The surfaces withdraw. Some signs reappear in contexts, on tablets, on tags, on storage jars, where stories are out of place. Instead, the motif is an assertion, an emblem, used not to recount but to designate. The observer is compelled to read, but finds only tokens, placeholders, the bare minimum of communication. Evidence accumulates in layers, yet the weight of absence is felt most sharply. You sense the desire for more, a plea for the myth where only the mark remains. Silence governs the register, where stories would have unfurled. In these arrays, the image is not a tale but a citation, not a memory but a marker. What once aspired to patterncraft now insists on function, utility, bureaucracy. Dust-covered boxes line the shelves, each packed with repetitions, and the records of repetition, a silent consensus that eludes completeness. These motifs glance at us through time, not storytelling, but signaling, not sequence, but collage. They ignore the legacy of narrative in favor of sheer persistence, an insistence of presence rather than remembrance. You pause, marking the difference. Before, the motifs seemed eager to speak. Now, they defer, yielding their surface, but not their story. The old assumption sits at the edge of understanding, bruised but not dispelled. Somewhere between archive and reconstruction, the loss is quietly acknowledged, a gap between what is visible and what can be known. The space between emblem and story stretches wider the longer one looks. The catalogues remain, impenetrable and sober, halting just as explanation threatens to emerge. What sort of message uses emblem, rather than story, to be legible across time? The passage into the interior stones invites old assumptions to cross the threshold. That what is found here, among the dust and the faded pigment, is devotion made material. Agricultural remains, in their confined and studied placements, prompt an accepted reading they must be offerings, given or abandoned, shaped to fit the demands of the sacred. The weight of tradition, slow and accumulative, carries this belief forward. Offerings, always offerings. grain and bean, husk and pod, as gifts to whatever silence fills the innermost spaces when the lamps have gone out. It is an expectation echoed in manuals, echoed again in field notes, sustained against time as the normal logic of these rooms. Yet, what the stone vaults yield resists that simplicity. The evidence releases itself only gradually, withdrawn and careful, stubbornly maintaining its distance. Charred seeds, dark fragments, carefully preserved by fire without intention, contorted and fragile within their coarse containers. Desiccated seeds, their forms unchanged by centuries of stillness, sealed and dormant beneath cracked ceramic, their provenance, scraped with hesitant tools into the soft skin of each container, refuses metaphor. The scratch marks tell a different story. Places, not prayers. Seasons, not sacraments. Each label, a brittle mapping of elsewhere onto here, signals something painstaking, something curated and meant to endure. Observation becomes a looping act. The evidence is not surrendered in a single gesture. Light passes over the joined lids of jars, over the dry silt pressed against pottery walls. There is no arrangement meant for spectacle. The inner chambers hold their inventory with an economy of drama. The packaging appears careful. Recursive layers of wrapping, clay pressed around seed, wads of woven reed, folds of fibre, all intent on controlling absence, of air, of moisture, of decay. What is stored is not only the seed, but the possibility of what the seed may yet become. Laboratory sheets, brittle as late summer, list the taxa in a hand drifting between precise and uncertain. The language is sparse: genus, species, count, status. Alongside, the records of context. Shelf allocation, chamber number, the condition of the seal upon opening. Moisture analyses, read in calibrated columns, speak only in decimals and gradients. The evidence is kept at the threshold of certainty, neither inviting nor denying, meaning a continual accounting of what has survived and in what state. There is a disciplined silence in these sheets. They do not allow the observer to stray far from what can be measured. They do not indulge memory, except as it interlaces with record. The registry in the field, its handwriting measured, its protocol standard details packaging methods, notes the tactile feel of sealing compounds, the echo of identical marks across distant deposits. Consistency, not display, is archived here. The written trace replaces presence. Technique substitutes for voice. Layered between dust and the faint tang of carbonization, the method is as present as the thing contained. All accumulates into a peculiar tension. Here, on the silent benches of the inner structure, seeds do not resolve into the immediacy of ritual consumption or destruction. The inventory, restrained and steady, hints at a logic that refuses the drama of immediate sacrifice. What is sealed has not been given away, nor wholly abandoned. It has been held in suspense. Objective and quiet, the collection preserves a possibility, the chance to act otherwise, later, elsewhere, if the need or occasion arises. No gesture here is final. The reserve is an admonition against haste, a calculated deferral. To conserve as contingency rather than conclusion is a gesture shaped by long absence and longer memory. The boxes and jars, endlessly similar, accumulate the slow sediment of knowledge about food. Their surfaces, abraded by time and hand, bear the traces of purposeful cataloguing. Not a shrine, but an archive. Not a feast, but a ledger written in seed coat and slip. The machinery of this preservation is evident only by what remains, always incomplete, always resisting interpretation. The labels persist, uneven and sometimes illegible, like a story started and halted, revived in part and silenced again. You pause, withdrawing from the ledgers and the careful disorder of catalogues. The air is patient here, thick with the silence of things set aside for futures never witnessed. Stone presses in, neither hostile nor inviting, merely fixed around what endures. A slow, cyclical pulse of curation repeats through each container, each marginal record, each faint impression on clay. The archive demands waiting. And in waiting, you sense the outlines of those who once waited, too, those for whom assurance was neither expected nor required. Who catalogued distant fields into the stone heart of these structures for seasons yet to come? The proposition, long resting in the mind, seems elementary. Walls separate, divide, defend. The wall as interruption, the wall as certainty, weight and bulk applied purposefully to push back the world, to secure what lies inside from what encroaches outside. You walk alongside the wall, tracing the slow, indifferent curve of its ancient profile. It stands calm against the wind, opaque to vision, a surface meant to hold absence beyond its stones, to resist passage. But within the literature of architecture and excavation, a note recurs almost peripheral, rarely underlined. The wall is also a container. The official reports betray no excitement. They recount features, measurements, the dull work of description. Yet there, beneath the sequence of layers and mortar, the observation slips in walls as repositories. Where one expects solid mass, there is embarrassing void. Cavities designed not for collapse, but for preservation. The defensive rampart's breadth, once thought only to hold weight, harbours hollow spaces, running deep and cool. Stillness reigns inside these concealed corridors. Catalogues record the items nestled behind mortared faces. Here, it is not chaos or the randomness of spoil. It is arrangement. Bundled clay tablets, at times folded slips, each placed in deliberate fashion, row beside row, layer upon layer. One visualizes the archaeological inventory: numbers, locations, orientation, bundle, shelf. The order is monotonous, repetitive, resistant to drama. Photography, grainy and resolute, supplies the only illumination, a silent procession of baked clay, cases leaning on shelves inside stone. Not a library in image, but in intent, or perhaps only in suggestion. Silence within silence. Archive embedded in defense. You are shown photographs, careful and methodical, rows of clay tablets. Their surfaces marked with subtle impressions, each fracture measuring the hand of time. The mass of the wall holds its own inertia, yet inside, these matrices bundles aligned, mortared shut, intentionally inaccessible except to the dedicated unwinding of excavation. No voice emerges from the binding, no narrative from the clay itself, merely the evidence of arrangement, the trace of some order, persistently resisting speculation. Inventory reports enumerate cross-reference, sequence number, content, shelf, bundle. The tablet is bundle 12, shelf 3, south-facing cavity, mortar type C. In the quiet of the laboratory, the cataloguer writes, placement consistent, content currently indeterminate. Sequence extends across a span, interrupted by gaps, by absence lacunae marked out as silence within record. Already the archive assumes a rhythm of presence and loss. Some items are missing, their impressions faint in dust. Some bundles remain unopened, sealed by the centuries. The observer is left with index numbers and empty brackets. There is no annotation, no hand to explain the rationale, the logic behind the placement. Only the rhythm of enumeration, the annotation of location, the melancholy of missing fragments. The wall's duality persists. The outside proclaims strength, the inside shelters memory, half erased. It is not a library in the familiar sense. The term is permitted only loosely, trailing after the catalogue notes. Yet, the resemblance is unignorable. Repetition, order, density, a system imposed on the clay, on the blankness of space, an archive sealed from view. The defensive purpose unsettled by the quiet insistence of storage. These archives are not open, not welcoming. They persist in darkness, in airlessness, clay breathing only dust. The edges of interpretation blur. Did the masons plan this remnant of memory as they stacked the stone? Or did cataloguers, centuries later, only uncover a compromised defense bending, almost imperceptibly, to the work of record-keeping? After the counting and description end, the cataloguers close their ledgers. They leave behind index numbers, missing entries, photographs, half illuminated by the uncertain light of excavation. Lacunae endure, the silences of what can never be restored. The shelves appear organized, but the story remains withheld. You watch as the wall resumes its mute stance. Stone reasserts its presence. The very idea of barrier complicated, haunting. Evidence alone bears the burden of meaning. A bundle of clay, a shelf sealed away, a catalogue closed over lines left blank. What remains is the space between what is preserved and what is lost, the silence within stone. Among these index numbers and placement maps, a single thought lingers at the threshold, waiting. Who, precisely, prepared these inner libraries, and for what eyes, if any, were they arranged? The accepted assumption settles like dusk over stone. Monumental inscriptions fixed and final. In the silent gravity of halls, every letter seems to insist on its own permanence. You have seen the expectation registered delicately among glass-cased fragments, on the lips of those who study from a respectful distance. As if stone resists the erosion of intention, as if any proclamation delivered in durable material cannot be unsettled by movement through time. There is a comfort in this imagination of finality. To inscribe in stone or clay is to reach toward eternity. Yet certainty, here, is only ever an arrangement of dust. You turn the pages and encounter the record of a different rhythm. Sequences of imprecise amendments and methodical notes. Each line a faint echo of hands, returning sometimes decades or centuries apart. Evidence accumulates within these silent documents, not in the form of narrative or motive, but as shadows of alteration. You see the margins, paired or abraded, the places where earlier lines recede beneath careful erasure. Sometimes the original surface is left trembling between what it once bore and what it now carries. Added lines stagger into view, not interruptions, but measured insertions, the script subtly sloping or compact, crowding the pre-existing rules. Are annotations awkward at first glance, undeniably written in a different hand, appended with an intention that does not announce itself? Some, lighter, almost float above the heavier incisions of the primary text, as if afraid to settle. Some press deeper, more confident. You peer closer, tracing the shifts in stroke, the minute changes in angle and form, the inescapable marks of later intervention. The stone and the clay preserve a palimpsest not only of statements but of edits. Finality cedes to quiet accumulation. Cross-dating extends this sense of revision along a stretched axis, tracing lines out across generations. The dates tally and separate, mapping moments where hands diverged in time but converged upon a single surface. An original line pressed centuries before is joined, challenged, or quietly corrected by another cut decades later. The conservation files contain these alignments with the chill vigilance of the archive. Each modification is recorded with a stratigraphic note, pinning the alteration within a careful schematic of before and after, the document itself now transformed into a map of the event's afterlives. The paleographic comparison inserts itself almost reluctantly. The script changes minutely, betraying the passage of years enough to warrant a separate entry. A passive voice suffuses the record this hand. Perhaps is not the hand of the original inscriber. The line, the curve, the stand of a particular character, all measured and considered. But the files do not speculate. The sequence is retained. Order imposed without narrative. Who wrote, who altered, who appended remains unassigned to name or intention. The archive records the act, not the agent. You survey these layered traces in their present state, aware of the quiet tension. These texts, treated with reverence as declarations preserved for all time, show by their wounds and additions that they were read as instruments with utility, with the possibility of modification. The erasures are rarely absolute. Older strokes peer from underneath, sometimes half legible, never erased beyond recovery. The later hand does not obliterate, it overlays. Each adjustment preserves something of its predecessor, preserving the moment of change as much as the new content. Within the notebooks, those silent sentinels of the record keepers, the narrative trails off into measured silence. Later hands modify, but the record of those hands is restrained to physical trace. There is no closing statement, no summary or conclusion. The observer notes what has changed. What overlays what? The presence of a margin, the shape of a letter. Beyond that, silence. It is as though the process can be charted, but not the reason, not the shifting context. The evidence, unadorned, admits only that it was touched and retouched over spans of years. The notebooks recognize the passage of authority from hand to hand, from century to century, but do not record its nature or origins. Authority becomes another kind of silence, a margin that resists inscription. The old presumption endures, not through evidence, but through habit of mind, a story, repeated until it settles into the dust of accepted truth. Structures rising from the plain, stone upon stone, invoke their own explanation. Vast and faceless labour, recruited from the edge of want, forced and forgotten, building under silent command. The anonymous, the impoverished, the pressed into service. To walk among these remnants is to inherit this narrative, to feel its weight in the chill of early morning before the archaeological day begins. Somewhere, one imagines, in an imagined past, a multitude shuffled, bent to the will of something larger and more indifferent than themselves. Yet assumptions, like stones, are weathered out of shape by what persists beyond them. The evidence asks to be reconsidered, inviting the observer closer, slower, more attentive to the pressure that time exerts upon record. In cramped storage drawers and silted pit floors, other forms of testimony remain. Bones, recovered from the margins of labour's spaces, neither on display nor entirely hidden. Each fragment is catalogued, accessioned in neat sequence, waiting beneath a thin veil of plastic or wrapped in neutral cloth. Their preservation is an act of impersonal attention, a gesture of care that is detached from sentiment. Osteological reports begin, as they always do, with context. Locus, stratum, the numerical language of circumstance. Then, the bones themselves, long bones showing sites of muscular insertion, vertebrae arching in subtle apology for burdens once borne. In the laboratory, each surface is measured, scored, and entered into columns. Noted. A wave of repetitive microtraumas along joint surfaces, but not distributed in the pattern of abrupt, indiscriminate labour. Instead, the markings echo the learned repetition of specialised crafts, movements refined by habit, not imposed by emergency. Hands and forearms hold the memory of tools held with precision, not only with force. Here, another layer. At the cellular threshold, specialists coax isotopic traces from the mineral matrix. Carbon and nitrogen ratios, filtered from ground dust and calculus, reveal a record neither lavish nor wanting. There are excursions, intervals of heightened protein intake, distinct from the background rhythm, recurrent but irregular. These are rations, not deprivation seasonal, perhaps cyclical, brief intensifications in the otherwise moderate procession of sustenance. Some individuals show higher amplitudes, others a muted trace of the same provision. There is no profile of starvation, nor of abundance, only unevenness. Mapping onto time. Sample contexts are described in the clipped vocabulary of analysis, their details sewn into tables. Specimen numbers, burial locus, chronostratigraphic horizon. The laboratory sheets bring a kind of order to what is observed. Each measurement is a moment of arrest, the present meeting the past in the split-second calibration of a tool, the slow, unanswerable quiet that follows each reading. Repetitive, specialized strain accumulates its record in the silent interior of hard tissue. Over years, tendons tugged, muscles contracted not at random, but under the regime of cycles. A cartilage rim here, an articular pit there, whisper a schedule of work performed with knowledge, mediated by technique, overseen perhaps by habit, more than by haste. There are no marks of trauma from sudden violence, no avalanche of failure. Instead, the body wears its pattern, the incised timetable of maintenance, more than construction. The skeletons do not declare their origins, but they resist anonymity. They bear the specificity of experience, not the blur of the mast. Comparative data is entered against reference populations assumed to be agriculturalists, against remains from known sites of coercive labour. Numbers accumulate, but explanations recede. The tables are full, the margins silent. The ultimate measure, perhaps, is found in what these sheets do not record. Nowhere is their cause described, only effect. Motivation does not fossilize. Aspiration, despair, contentment, these are not among the laboratory findings. The reader is left before the evidence, encircled by suggestion and bounded by record. There is a tension in all of this, elegant and unstated. Coordination, provisioning, cycles of attention. These appear where coercion was supposed to dwell. The organization of labor, glimpsed only in the shadow play between numbers, is not reducible to the undifferentiated press of command. The evidence does not suggest a gathering of the powerless shaped only by necessity. Rather, it speaks quietly of cycles, periods, rhythms of skill recognized in flesh and mineral, of differential attention to bodily needs. The implacable machinery of oppression is not corroborated, but neither is its absence declared. The bones are archives, not declarations. Their testimony is more fragment than doctrine, an erosion, not an inscription. After the reports, silence. After the measurements, nothing but the hush of storage, the dust that settles on unlabeled bags. The observer lingers at the edge of what can be known, uncertain if the gap is one of ignorance or principle. The maintenance of structures endures in the evidence, but never quite resolves into a story of those who endured them. What social arrangement is encoded in bones that bear the schedule of upkeep? The principle preserves its elegance. What endures in the dust and residue of stone tells the story of use. Here, now, then. A vessel unearthed from a chamber floor, sealed and silent, must indicate that it was part of the life that congregated in that space. Aromatics, spilled and absorbed, pressed into the walls and fibers of ritual. The accepted wisdom. Each artifact, each trace, is affirmation of a local practice, rehearsed, remembered, inscribed in the physical fabric of this interior. The surface of the amphora, the shared touch, the faint memory of hands, all combine to convince us. What is found within must belong to here, and here alone. The sample is drawn with steady hands, glass pipette to ancient curve, and the transfer is almost silent. Even in this pause, chemical residue analysis offers no certainty, only a reconfiguration of the familiar. Lipids, ancient oils, and the heavier remains of distant resins are coaxed out molecules adrift, unmoored, waiting to be named in the chill air of the lab. Each profile glowing on a screen, annotated with quiet precision, a double bond there, a chain length here, unveils not local genesis, but strangeness. Diterpenoids and molecular signatures speak in forensic tongues. The resins do not match the forests in the hills above, nor the oils the groves in the nearby valleys. Instead, they echo coastlines that remain unnamed in these chambers, and for a moment, the borders of ritual and resource seem more porous than the stone that shields them. The amphorae are lifted, numbered, described, their bodies marked with the scrawled codes of vanished ports. Shipping marks, estranged from purpose, adorn the ceramic as if speaking a dialect of exchange. Inventory numbers are transformed in the field ledger. Each entry mirrors a moment of movement, a memory of passage from elsewhere. These notations are persistent but opaque, more a reminder of distance than of destination. The amphorae, these deliberate containers, have held their contents with a kind of mute discipline, surface words pressed against time. It gathers instead as a slow sediment in the record, never one voice, never decisive. Oils pressed from olives that never grew within sight of these hills. Resin bled from trees whose names are unfamiliar in the dialect of ceremony. All distilled and sealed. The chemical profiles, recorded in the laboratory logs, bear witness a subtle catalogue that travels from excavation notebooks to refrigeration units, where small vials are stored in blue-lit silence. Each sample labelled, keyed, and cooled, neither resolved nor forgotten, preserved against the slow insistence of decay. The language of analysis insists on repetition, and in each stage, a narrowing of possibility. The numbers recalculated, the markers re-identified, but the outcome always held at a remove from finality. The rooms themselves offer little in the way of reaction. Stone absorbs as much as it reflects. No immediate display, no act of public devotion. These foreign oils, these exotic resins, are not arrayed on altars, not visible in the record of performance. Instead, they are conserved, hidden within, stored as resource, not spectacle. What purpose preserves what is rare? No voices cross the threshold to explain. The inventory numbers repeat along the shelf edges, each a cipher for a crossing lost to time. There is a quiet discipline to these movements. In the laboratory, the vials are placed in order, sealed lids taut against time. Temperature charts flutter at the edge of vision. A record keeper's hands press labels against glass. Resin from the southern coast, oil with a spectral curve matching an island grove. Catalogued and keyed, the field ledger lies heavy with crossings out and corrections, expectancy nudged aside by residue. The amphorae stand, reordered in their trays. Shipping marks blurred by soil. The codes of distant ports nearly erased by transportation and burial. What is filed, what is preserved, is always a negotiation between what can be recovered and what slips into absence. Silence persists in all directions. Within the cool hush of the lab, beneath the stone ceilings of the storage room, in the narrow interstices between inventory numbers. The origin of these substances, the motive for their retention, rests beneath the interpretive surface. No explanation is immediate, no meaning declared. Instead, what is observed and preserved is simply noted, absorbed, and carried forward, but never resolved. The residue marks a passage, but not its cause. The amphora lid creaks only in the imagination, the hand that sealed it no longer known, the purpose absent among the faint aromas diffusing in lost air. Who packed foreign smells into the heart of these buildings for hands who would not remember the origin? It begins as all assumptions do with a surface, a conviction that settles into the mortar. There is the believed solidity of stone, the finality of brick wrapped around forgotten silence. It is comfortable. Here, you are told, the masonry thickens not to admit, but to refuse. Once laid, it holds its line against time. It is impermeable. Nothing passes. It is supposed to be complete, a finished thought in lime, sand, and fired clay, impervious as memory wants to be. Even as you approach, the weight of this expectation crowds out sound. The very air is arrested by the promise of impenetrability. Yet it is always the quietest traces that unsettle belief. The survey unfolds slowly. Here, behind facades revered for their mass, the record offers an unanticipated reversal. There are places where the brick runs deeper than custom, where patterned thickness suggests not only exclusion, but deliberation. It holds a shadow of intent. Peering under dust and lamplight, the surveyor notes a faint relief where the surface is not uniform. The fingering of edges yields to softer pressure. Bricks shift not just as a trick of settlement, but as if they are intended to come away. Measured drawings record these anomalies in graphite, each keyed joint, each faint scribe, the careful geometry of an access point. The hand that records them pauses, uncertain. This is not what was meant to be found. In the notes, there is restraint. Dimensions are marked beside the hesitancies. 23 centimeters, 11.2. The subtle difference in width that lets a single brick lift free from its neighbors. For each occurrence, the catalogue swells with quiet repetition. Removable, not replaced with unconcern, reseated, not sealed forever. The difference is minute and absolute. Beyond it, a narrow corridor opens inward, a slot of midnight air between the courses. Not so wide as to beckon many, but deliberate, just enough for passage. It is not the main thoroughfare, but an access, a possibility embedded within mass. The chamber within is empty. The corridor is neither ruin nor completion, merely a presence between intentions. Here, evidence is not an argument, but an atmosphere. You take up the measured drawing, run your thumb along the notations left by another observer. The joinery marks are not flamboyant. They are crisp, faint, the suggestion of a craftsman's scripting in reverse. One keyed brick, turned slightly, holds the memory of a tool. Behind it, the mortar is dry set. The fracture line archives the act of placement and removal repeated over years. Chalk residue catches the light, numbering the sequence in which bricks were once lifted free and carefully replaced. Names for these methods do not survive here. Only the record endures marks in margins, undemonstrative but persistent, each annotation a tiny aperture in knowledge's thick facade. Instead, the plans themselves become a kind of dialogue of absence. Massive exteriors render the promise of endurance. Yet just beneath, patience opens a corridor, a passage where permanence makes a space for returning. Conservation notes file these observations without fanfare. Replacement bricks distinguished not by hue or glaze, but a certain feathering of the joint were set to be disturbed. Not unbreakable, not careless replacement, but a design for withdrawal and return. The record observes, without thesis, that the brick is as easily cradled in absence as in place. The almost invisible scratch at the joint, the measured drawing is layered with these markings. Each a translation of physical experience into archival silence. Even now, under your fingertips, the drawing is cool, slightly rough, the evidence both offered and withheld. You run through the catalogue again. Joinery keyed to a logic just beyond interpretation. The impossibly subtle caesura between two identical surfaces. Is it only function, or a whisper of something else, an accommodation for time, for care, for a return that was never spoken? The answer is mothballed in the margin. Silent. The contradiction does not settle. It lingers in the shifting presence of absence. Heavy-faced exteriors masking that narrow invitation within. The transition between threshold and chamber is neither abrupt nor fully disclosed. In the litany of measured notations and conservation diagrams, you circle the implications without tracing new claims. No names suggest who determined that permanence would yield in specific places. That stone would admit itself to reversal. No records specify the hand, only the intention remembered in pattern, in reversible massing, in the echo of passage and return. Dust gathers in the corridor under the skin of the wall. The air holds the expectation of being undisturbed, yet the evidence argues gently against it. The silence is not total, it is an active thing. Surrounding each joinery mark, each reseated brick, each corridor that cuts a shadow through the stone's assertion of forever. Here, you do not look for conclusions. You look for what persists, the dim persistence of possibility, built quietly into the bone of closure itself. The plan is filed away, the corridor remains, and you are left to wonder. Who designed permanence, with a built-in invitation to return and tend the inner heart? There is a simplicity in assumption that soothes the surface of things. In the order of artifacts, in the succession of administrative emblems impressed on clay, the prevailing belief remains untroubled. One seal implies one authority. A seal belongs, if not to a named hand, then to a circumscribed presence, always singular, always anchored in a discrete period of control. Each impression on mud or wax seems to declare, here, at this point in the fragmentary register of power, one name, one office, one guiding will. The orderliness appeals, each badge pointing back to its originator, each marked surface threading administrative logic across time's opaque long stretches. This, they say, is how memory is kept, a chronology of emblems echoing the sequence of rule. But you notice the surface falter under prolonged observation. In the dim hush of the archive or the silent breadth of excavation, dust gathering on stone, a cataloguer's lamp tracing contours through shifting shadow. The evidence holds its own quiet contradictions. The seals are not obedient to figuration. Clay seal impressions recur, repeating a formal device not once, but layered, stacked across occupational strata that resist collapse into a single narrative. The emblems are not isolated to a reign, a tenure, an autarkic hand. Instead, they appear again and again, unmoored from named rulers, scattered across contexts, persisting as if without master, untethered to the warmth of living authority. The pattern is not a chain but a cycle, not a single imprint but echoes, somber, unflagging. You find that the epigraphic register, so laboriously assembled sheets laid side by side in silence, each impression indexed, every context noted with fine-tipped care, complicates the ease of attribution. What seems clear at first becomes clouded, softened at the margins. The impressions are not always accompanied by a name, nor by any sure sign of office. Instead, repetition stands in for authorship, echo for owner. The sheets become archives of recurrence, not of provenance. There is a calm in the records, each entry aligned along measured lines, yet the repetition itself erodes the expected certainty, and you sense the difference not in what is written, but in what is left unsaid. The seals reappear without statement, recurring in rooms long abandoned, crossing the invisible boundaries that separate one era from another. The device, the persistent emblem, eludes the pinning down that attribution demands. Clay stores the traces faithfully. Each impression, pressed into yielding surface, preserves the relief of a device, a curve, a line, a motif unaltered, though the context slips. In one stratum, the mark emerges among collapsed walls and fragments of ledgers. In another layer, separated by the slow sediment of intervening years, the identical imprint rests among the relics of a different order collected, perhaps by another gesture, another unseen observer. The catalogue expands. Molds are compared and recompared, impression against impression, context weighed against context. Fingers run over dull outlines. Sheets are annotated in neat script. Yet, the typology recorded is agnostic. It cares little for attribution, preferring instead the abstraction of repetition, the language of recurrence, rather than of identity. The spaces allotted for names left blank, expectant. Each blank a silence, each number an empty cradle waiting to be filled, never filled. It is the serial that persists as the index, the skeletal structure, mapping recurrence without origin. The lack of association acquires weight. The emblem, deprived of patron, is more shadow than testimony. It becomes not the hallmark of a singular hand, but a technical mark, a recurrence that speaks to something continuous, diffuse, perhaps institutional, but never disclosed. The motif, recast by time and reticence, persists without haste, neither explained nor explained away. The layers of clay, the palimpsest of impressions that refuse confinement to neatly ordered narratives, suggest neither rupture nor simple replacement, but a quieter form of persistence. The device survives its makers, outliving the vanishing lines of named authority. Silence hovers at the edge of every sheet, in the dust between the shelf and the catalogue, in the interval between successive impressions separated by uncountable nights. The evidence oscillates, weighted by what is present and what is unaccounted for. The registry remains open, unfinished, the notation trailing away into spaces left for anyone to ascribe authorship. You stand, in the hush that follows careful documentation, and let the register of seals settle in the mind like slow falling ash. What is left when the emblem outlasts every patron, every voice once authorized to speak its name? Across the silent gap between generation and generation, whose continuity is it that the seal, recurring and recurrent, actually marks? You return, quieter than when you arrived. Stone and clay lie in files and drawers. The evidence does not demand a single answer. It asks for stewardship. If these monuments are messages, then we inherit the caretaking of their silence. Consider what you will carry forward. Consider what you will leave behind. If this slow work matters to you, like and subscribe, and return when the records have cooled. What will you remember?